Introduction: up versus down. Look down. What do you see? Your hands, your desk, the floor, maybe a cup of coffee, or a laptop computer or a newspaper. What do they have in common? These are things you can touch. What you see when you look down are things within your reach, things you can control right now, things you can move and manipulate with no planning, effort, or thought. Whether it's a result of your work, the kindness of others, or simple good fortune, much of what you see when you look down is yours. There are things in your possession. Now look up. What do you see? The ceiling, perhaps pictures on a wall, or things out the window, trees, houses, buildings, clouds in the sky. Whatever is in the distance, what do they have in common? To reach them, you have to plan, think, calculate. Even if it's only a little, it still requires some coordinated effort. Unlike what we see when we look down, the realm of up shows us things that we have to think about and work for in order to get. Sounds simple because it is. Yet to the brain this distinction is the gateway between two wildly different ways of thinking, two utterly different ways of dealing with the world. In your brain, the down world is managed by a handful of chemicals, neurotransmitters. They're called, that let you experience satisfaction and enjoy whatever you have in the here and now. But when you turn your attention to the world of up, your brain relies on a different chemical. A single molecule that not only allows you to move beyond the realm of what's at your fingertips, but also motivates you to pursue, to control, and to possess the world beyond your immediate grasp. It drives you to seek out those things far away, both physical things and things you cannot see, such as knowledge, love, and power. Whether it's reaching across the table for the salt shaker, flying to the moon in a spaceship, or worshiping a god beyond space and time, this chemical gives us command over every distance. Whether geographical or intellectual, those down chemicals, call them the here and nows, allow you to experience what's in front of you. They enable you to savor and enjoy, or perhaps to fight or run away. Right now, the up chemical is different. It makes you desire what you don't yet have, and drives you to seek new things. It rewards you when you obey it, and makes you suffer when you don't. It is the source of creativity and, further along the spectrum, madness. It is the key to addiction and the path to recovery. It is the bit of biology that makes an ambitious executive sacrifice everything in pursuit of success, that makes successful actors and entrepreneurs and artists keep working long after they have all the money and fame they ever dreamed of, and that makes a satisfied husband or wife risk everything for the thrill of someone else. It is the source of the undeniable itch that drives scientists to find explanations and philosophers to find order, reason, and meaning. It is why we look into the sky for redemption and God. It is why heaven is above and earth is below. It is fuel for the motor of our dreams. It is the source of our despair when we fail. It is why we seek and succeed. It is why we discover and prosper. It is also why we are never happy for very long. To your brain, this single molecule is the ultimate multipurpose device, urging us, through thousands of neurochemical processes, to move beyond the pleasure of just being, into exploring the universe of possibilities that come when we imagine. Mammals, reptiles, birds, and fish all have this chemical inside their brains, but no creature has more of it than a human being. It is a blessing and a curse, a motivation and a reward. Carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, plus a single nitrogen atom. It is simple in form and complex in result. This is dopamine, and it narrates no less than the story of human behavior. And if you want to feel it right now, if you want to put it in charge, you can do that. Look up. A note from the authors. We've packed this book full of the most interesting scientific experiments we could find. Still, some parts are speculative, especially in later chapters. In addition, there are places where we oversimplify to make the material easier to understand. The brain is so complex that even the most sophisticated neuroscientist must simplify to build a model of the brain that's capable of being understood. Also, science is messy. Sometimes studies contradict one another, and it takes time to sort out which results are correct. Reviewing the entire body of evidence would quickly become tedious for the reader. So we selected studies that have influenced the field in important ways and that reflect scientific consensus. When consensus exists, science is not only messy, it can sometimes be bizarre. The search for understanding human behavior can take strange forms. It's not like studying chemicals in a test tube or even infections in living people. Brain researchers have to find ways to trigger important behaviors in a laboratory environment. Sometimes sensitive behaviors driven by passions such as fear, greed, or sexual desire. When possible, we chose studies that highlight this strangeness. Human research in all its forms is tricky. It's not the same as clinical care, in which a doctor and a patient work together to treat the patient's illness. In that case, they choose whatever treatment they think will work best, and the only goal is to make the patient better. The goal of research, on the other hand, is to answer a scientific question, even though scientists work hard to minimize the risks to their participants. The science must come first. Sometimes, access to experimental treatments can be life-saving, but usually research participants are exposed to risks they wouldn't experience in the course of regular clinical care. By volunteering to take part in studies, participants sacrifice some of their own safety for the benefit of others. Sick people who will enjoy a better life if the research is successful. It's like a firefighter running into a burning building to rescue the people trapped inside, choosing to place himself in danger for the welfare of others. The key element, of course, is that the research participant needs to know exactly what she's getting herself into. It's called informed consent, and usually comes in the form of a lengthy document that explains the purpose of the research and lists the risks of becoming involved. It's a good system, though not perfect. Participants don't always read it carefully, especially if it's very long. Sometimes researchers leave things out because deception is an essential part of the study. But, in general, scientists do their best to make sure their participants are willing partners as they tackle the mysteries of human behavior. Chapter 1 Love. You found the one you waited for all your life, so why doesn't the honeymoon last forever? In which we explore the chemicals that make you want sex and fall in love. And why, sooner or later, everything changes. Sean wiped a clear space on his steamed-over bathroom mirror, ran his fingers through his black hair, smiled. "This'll work," he said. He dropped his towel and admired his flat belly. His obsession with the gym had produced 2/3 of a six-pack. From that, his mind went to a more pressing obsession. He had not been out with anyone since February, which was a nice way of saying he hadn't had sex in 7 months and 3 days. And he was disturbed to realize he had kept track so precisely. That streak ends tonight, he thought. At the bar, he surveyed the possibilities. There were a lot of attractive women here tonight, not that looks were everything. He missed sex, sure, but he also missed having someone in his life, someone to text for no reason. Someone who could be a welcome part of every day. He considered himself a romantic, even if tonight was just about sex. He kept meeting the eyes of a young woman standing with a chatty friend at a high-top table. She had dark hair and brown eyes, and he noticed her because she wasn't in the usual Saturday night uniform. She had on flats instead of heels, and she wore Levis instead of club clothes. He introduced himself and the conversation came quickly and easily. Her name was Samantha, and the first thing she said was that she was more comfortable doing cardio than putting back beers. That led to an in-depth discussion of local gyms, fitness apps, and the relative merits of working out in the morning versus the afternoon. For the rest of the night he didn't leave her side, and she quickly came to like having him there. Lots of factors pushed them along to what would become a long-term relationship. Their common interests. The ease they felt with each other. Even the drinks and a little desperation. But none of that was the real key to love. The big factor was this: they were both under the influence of a mind-altering chemical. So was everyone else in the bar. And, it turns out, so are you. What is more powerful than pleasure? Dopamine was discovered in the brain in 1957 by Kathleen Montagu, a researcher working in a laboratory at the Runwell Hospital near London. Initially, dopamine was seen simply as a way for the body to produce a chemical called norepinephrine, which is what adrenaline is called when it is found in the brain. But then scientists began to observe strange things. Only 0.0005% of brain cells produce dopamine, 1 in 2 million, yet these cells appeared to exert an outsized influence on behavior. Research participants experienced feelings of pleasure when they turned dopamine on, and went to great lengths to trigger the activation of these rare cells. In fact, under the right circumstances, pursuit of feel-good dopamine activation became impossible to resist. Some scientists christened dopamine the pleasure molecule, and the pathway that dopamine-producing cells take through the brain was named the reward circuit. The reputation of dopamine as the pleasure molecule was further cemented through experiments with drug addicts. The researchers injected them with a combination of cocaine and radioactive sugar, which allowed the scientists to figure out which parts of their brains were burning the most calories. As the intravenous cocaine took effect, participants were asked to rate how high they felt. Researchers discovered that the greater the activity in the dopamine reward pathway, the greater the high. As the body cleared the cocaine from the brain, dopamine activity decreased, and the high faded. Additional studies produced similar results. The role of dopamine as the pleasure molecule was established. Other researchers tried to duplicate the results, and that's when unexpected things began to happen. They reasoned that it's unlikely that dopamine pathways evolved to encourage people to get high on drugs. Drugs were probably causing an artificial form of dopamine stimulation. It seemed more likely that the evolutionary processes that harnessed dopamine were driven by the need to motivate survival and reproductive activity. So they replaced cocaine with food, expecting to see the same effect. What they found surprised everyone. It was the beginning of the end for dopamine as the pleasure molecule. Dopamine, they discovered, isn't about pleasure at all. Dopamine delivers a feeling much more influential. Understanding dopamine turns out to be the key to explaining and even predicting behavior across a spectacular range of human endeavors. Creating art, literature, and music, seeking success. Discovering new worlds and new laws of nature. Thinking about God, and falling in love. Sean knew he was in love. His insecurities melted away. Every day made him feel on the brink of a golden future. As he spent more time with Samantha, his excitement about her grew, and his sense of anticipation became constant. Every thought of her suggested limitless possibilities. As for sex, his libido was stronger than ever. But only for her. Other women ceased to exist. Even better, when he tried to confess all this happiness to Samantha, she interrupted him to say she felt exactly the same. Sean wanted to be sure they would be together forever. So one day he proposed to her. She said yes. A few months after their honeymoon, things began to change. At the start they had been obsessed with one another, but, with the passage of time, that desperate longing became less desperate. The belief that anything was possible became less certain, less obsessive, less at the center of everything. Their elation receded. They weren't unhappy, but the profound satisfaction from their earlier time together was slipping away. The sense of limitless possibilities began to seem unrealistic. Thoughts about each other, that used to come constantly, didn't. Other women began to draw Sean's attention, not that he intended to cheat. Samantha let herself flirt sometimes, too, even if it was no more than a shared smile with the college boy bagging groceries in the checkout line. They were happy together, but the early gloss of their new life began to feel like their old life apart. The magic, whatever it was fading. Just like my last relationship, thought Samantha. Been there, done that, thought Sean. Monkeys and rats and why love fades. In some ways rats are easier to study than human beings. Scientists can do a lot more to them without having to worry about the research ethics board knocking at their door. To test the hypothesis that both food and drugs stimulate dopamine, the scientists implanted electrodes directly into rats' brains so they could directly measure the activity of individual dopamine neurons. Next, they built cages with chutes for food pellets. The results were just as they expected. As soon as they dropped the first pellet, the rats' dopamine systems lit up. Success. Natural rewards stimulate dopamine activity just as well as cocaine and other drugs. Next, they did something the original experimenters had not. They kept going, monitoring the rats' brains as pellets of food were dropped down the chute, day after day. The results were wholly unexpected. The rats devoured the food as enthusiastically as ever. They were obviously enjoying it, but their dopamine activity shut down. Why would dopamine stop firing when stimulation keeps coming? The answer came from an unlikely source, a monkey and a light bulb. Wolfram Schultz is among the most influential pioneers of dopamine experimentation. As a professor of neurophysiology at the University of Freiburg, Switzerland, he became interested in the role of dopamine in learning. He implanted tiny electrodes into the brains of macaque monkeys where dopamine cells clustered together. He then placed the monkeys in an apparatus that had 2 lights and 2 boxes. Every once in a while one of the lights turned on. One light was a signal that the food pellet could be found in the box on the right. The other meant the food pellet was in the box on the left. It took the monkeys some time to figure out the rule. At first they opened the boxes randomly, and got it right about half the time. When they found a food pellet, the dopamine cells in their brain fired, just as in the rats. After a while, the monkeys figured out the signals and reached for the correct, food-containing box every time. And at that, the timing of the dopamine release began to change from firing at the discovery of the food to firing at the light. Why? Seeing the light go on would always be unexpected. But once the monkeys figured out that the light meant they were about to get food, the surprise they felt came exclusively from the appearance of the light, not from the food. From that, a new hypothesis arose. Dopamine activity is not a marker of pleasure. It is a reaction to the unexpected, to possibility and anticipation. As human beings, we get a dopamine rush from similar, promising surprises. The arrival of a sweet note from your lover, an email message from a friend you haven't seen in years, or, if you're looking for romance, meeting a fascinating new partner at a sticky table in the same old bar. But when these things become regular events, their novelty fades, and so does the dopamine rush. And a sweeter note or a longer email or a better table won't bring it back. This simple idea provides a chemical explanation for an age-old question. Why does love fade? Our brains are programmed to crave the unexpected and thus to look to the future, where every exciting possibility begins. But when anything, including love, becomes familiar, that excitement slips away, and new things draw our attention. The scientists who studied this phenomenon named the buzz we get from novelty reward prediction error. And it means just what the name says. We constantly make predictions about what's coming next, from what time we can leave work, to how much money we expect to find when we check our balance at the ATM. When what happens is better than what we expect, it is literally an error in our forecast of the future. Maybe we get to leave work early, or we find $100 more in checking than we expected. That happy error is what launches dopamine into action. It's not the extra time or the extra money themselves. It's the thrill of the unexpected good news. In fact, the mere possibility of a reward prediction error is enough for dopamine to swing into action. Imagine you're walking to work on a familiar street, one you've traveled many times before. All of a sudden you notice that a new bakery has opened, one you've never seen. You immediately want to go in and see what they have. That's dopamine taking charge, and it produces a feeling different from enjoying how something tastes, feels, or looks. It's the pleasure of anticipation, the possibility of something unfamiliar and better. You're excited about the bakery, yet you haven't eaten any of their pastries, sampled any of their coffee, or even seen how it looks inside. You go in and order a cup of dark roast and a croissant. You take a sip of the coffee. The complex flavors play across your tongue. It's the best you've ever had. Next you take a bite of the croissant. It's buttery and flaky, exactly like the one you had years ago at a cafe in Paris. Now how do you feel? Maybe that your life is a little better with this new way to start your day. From now on you're going to come here every morning for breakfast and have the best coffee and flakiest croissant in the city. You'll tell your friends about it, probably more than they care to hear. You'll buy a mug with the cafe's name on it. You'll even be more excited to start the day because, well, this awesome cafe. That's why. That's dopamine in action. It's as if you have fallen in love with the cafe. Yet sometimes when we get the things we want, it's not as pleasant as we expect. Dopaminergic excitement doesn't last forever, because eventually the future becomes the present. The thrilling mystery of the unknown becomes the boring familiarity of the everyday, at which point dopamine's job is done, and the letdown sets in. The coffee and croissants were so good, you made that bakery your regular breakfast stop. But after a few weeks, the best coffee and croissant in the city became the same old breakfast. But it wasn't the coffee and the croissant that changed, it was your expectation. In the same way, Samantha and Sean were obsessed with each other until their relationship became utterly familiar. When things become part of the daily routine, there is no more reward prediction error, and dopamine is no longer triggered to give you those feelings of excitement. Sean and Samantha surprised each other in a sea of anonymous faces at a bar, then obsessed over each other until the imagined future of never-ending delight became the concrete experience of reality. Dopamine's job and ability to idealize the unknown came to an end, so dopamine shut down. Passion rises when we dream of a world of possibility, and fades when we are confronted by reality. When the god or goddess of love beckoning you to the boudoir becomes a sleepy spouse blowing his or her nose into a ratty Kleenex. The nature of love, the reason to stay, must change from dopaminergic dreams to something else. But what? One brain, two worlds. John Douglas Pettigrew, Emeritus Professor of Physiology at the University of Queensland, Australia, is a native of the delightfully named city of Wagga Wagga. Pettigrew had a brilliant career as a neuroscientist, and is best known for updating the flying primates theory, which established bats as our distant cousins. While working on this idea, Pettigrew became the first person to clarify how the brain creates a three-dimensional map of the world. That sounds far removed from passionate relationships, but it would turn out to be a key concept for explaining dopamine and love. Pettigrew found that the brain manages the external world by dividing it into separate regions, the parapersonal and the extrapersonal. Basically, near and far. Parapersonal space includes whatever is in arm's reach, things you can control right now by using your hands. This is the world of what's real, right now. Extrapersonal space refers to everything else, whatever you can't touch unless you move beyond your arm's reach, whether it's 3 feet or 3 million miles away. This is the realm of possibility. With those definitions in place, another fact follows, obvious but useful. Since moving from one place to another takes time, any interaction in the extrapersonal space must occur in the future, or, to put it another way, distance is linked to time. For instance, if you're in the mood for a peach, but the closest one is sitting in a bin at the corner market, you can't enjoy it now. You can only enjoy it in the future, after you go get it. Acquiring something out of your reach may also take some planning. It could be as simple as standing up to turn on a light, walking to the market for that peach, or figuring out how to launch a rocket to get to the moon. This is the defining characteristic of things in the extrapersonal space. To get them requires effort, time, and in many cases, planning. By contrast, anything in the parapersonal space can be experienced in the here and now. Those experiences are immediate. We touch, taste, hold, and squeeze. We feel happiness, sadness, anger, and joy. This brings us to a clarifying fact of neurochemistry. The brain works one way in the parapersonal space and another way in the extrapersonal space. If you were designing the human mind, it makes sense that you would create a brain that distinguishes between things in this way. One system for what you have and another for what you don't. For early humans, the familiar phrase either you have it or you don't could be translated into either you have it or you're dead. From an evolutionary standpoint, food that you don't have is critically different from food that you do have. It's the same for water, shelter, and tools. The division is so fundamental that separate pathways and chemicals evolved in the brain to handle parapersonal and extrapersonal space. When you look down, you look into the parapersonal space, and for that the brain is controlled by a host of chemicals concerned with experience in the here and now. But when the brain is engaged with the extrapersonal space, one chemical exercises more control than all the others. The chemical associated with anticipation and possibility. Dopamine. Things in the distance, things we don't have yet, cannot be used or consumed, only desired. Dopamine has a very specific job, maximizing resources that will be available to us in the future. The pursuit of better things. Every part of living is divided in this way. We have one way of dealing with what we want, and another way of dealing with what we have. Wanting a house, experiencing the kind of desire that motivates the hard work necessary to find it and purchase it, uses a different set of brain circuits than enjoying it once it's yours. Anticipating a raise activates future-oriented dopamine, and it feels very different from the here and now experience of receiving the larger paycheck for the second or third time. And finding love takes a different set of skills than making love stay. Love must shift from an extrapersonal experience to a parapersonal one, from pursuit to possession, from something we anticipate to something we have to take care of. These are vastly different skills, which is why over time the nature of love has to change, and why, for so many people, love fades away at the end of the dopamine thrill we call romance. Yet many people make the transition. How do they do it? How are they outsmarting the seduction of dopamine? Glamour. Glamour is a beautiful illusion. The word glamour originally meant a literal magic spell that promises to transcend ordinary life and make the ideal real. It depends on a special combination of mystery and grace. Too much information breaks the spell. Virginia Postral glamour is present when we see things that stimulate our dopaminergic imagination, drowning out our ability to accurately perceive here and now reality. A good example is air travel. Look up. Is there an airplane in the sky? What kinds of thoughts and feelings are triggered? Many people experience a longing to be on the plane, traveling to exotic locations that are far away. A carefree getaway that begins with a ride among the clouds. Of course, if you were on the plane, your here and now senses would inform you that this paradise in the sky is more like a rush-hour bus across town, cramped, exhausting, and unpleasant. The opposite of elegant. Likewise, what could be more glamorous than Hollywood? Beautiful actors and actresses go to parties, stand around swimming pools, and flirt. The reality is far different, involving 14-hour days sweating under hot lights. Women actors are exploited sexually and men are pressured to take steroids and growth hormone to get the fabulous bodies we see on screen. Gwyneth Paltrow, Megan Fox, Charlize Theron, and Marilyn Monroe have all described casting couch experiences. Nick Nolte, Charlie Sheen, Mickey Rourke, and Arnold Schwarzenegger have all admitted to using steroids, which can cause liver damage, mood swings, violent outbursts, and psychosis. It's a tawdry business. Mountains aren't tawdry, though. They're majestic, standing far off in the distance, softened by the blurring effect of miles of air. Like a soft focus photograph of a bride on her wedding day, those with higher levels of dopamine want to climb it, explore it, conquer it. But they can't, because it doesn't exist. The mountain itself exists, but the imagined experience of being on it is impossible to achieve. The reality is that most of the time you're on a mountain you can't even tell. Typically you're surrounded by trees, and that's all you see. Occasionally you might come to a scenic overlook in which you can see for miles over the valley. But as you look, it's the faraway valley that's full of promise and beauty, not the mountain you're standing on. Glamour creates desires that cannot be fulfilled because they are desires for things that exist only in the imagination. Whether it's an airplane in the sky, a movie star in Hollywood, or a distant mountain, only things that are out of reach can be glamorous. Only things that are unreal. Glamour is a lie. One day at lunch, Samantha ran into DeMarco, her last serious boyfriend before Sean. They hadn't seen each other in years, hadn't even come across each other on Facebook. She found him as funny and smart as ever, and in great shape, too. In minutes she was starry-eyed again. Here was something she hadn't felt in a long time, the surge of excitement and the sense of possibility with a man who connected with her. Someone who seemed full of fresh things for her to discover. He was excited, too, and anxious to share his feelings. The first thing he shared was how excited he was to be engaged. His fiancée was the one and he hoped Samantha would meet her, because he had never cared for someone so special as this new woman. After DeMarco left, Samantha decided this was a good day to drink. She adjourned to the bar and ordered a basket of tortilla chips and a Miller Lite, and spent the next half hour picking at the label. She loved Sean, she really did, or did she? They had been in a rut for most of a year. That feeling with DeMarco was what she wanted. She had once had it with Sean, but not anymore. The dark side. There's a dark side to dopamine. If you drop a pellet of food into a rat's cage, the animal will experience a dopamine surge. Who knew that the world was a place where food dropped from the sky? But if you keep dropping pellets every 5 minutes, dopamine stops. The rat knows when to expect the food, so there's no surprise, and there is no error in the rat's prediction of a reward. But what if you drop the pellet at random times, so it's always a surprise? And what if, instead of rats and food pellets, you replace them with people and money? Picture the busy floor of a casino with a crowded blackjack table, a high-stakes poker game, and a spinning roulette wheel. It's the epitome of Vegas glitz. But casino operators know that these high-roller games are not where the biggest profits are made. Those come from the lowly slot machine, beloved by tourists, retirees, and workaday gamblers who drop in daily for a few hours alone with flashing lights, ringing bells, and clicking wheels. The modern standard for casino design is to dedicate a whopping 80% of floor space to slot machines, and for good reason. Slot machines bring in the majority of casino gambling revenue. One of the world's largest manufacturers of slot machines is owned by a company called Scientific Games. Science plays a big role in the design of these compelling devices. Although slot machines date back to the 19th century, modern refinements are based on the pioneering work of behavioral scientist B.F. Skinner, who in the 1960s mapped out the principles of behavior manipulation. In one experiment, Skinner placed a pigeon in a box. He found that he could condition it to peck a lever to get a pellet of food. Some experiments used 1 peck, others 10, but the number required never changed within any single experiment. The results weren't particularly interesting. Regardless of the number of presses required, each pigeon pecked at its lever like a bureaucrat stamping an endless pile of documents. Then Skinner tried something different. He set up an experiment in which the number of presses needed to release a pellet changed randomly. Now the pigeon never knew when the food would come. Every reward was unexpected. The birds became excited. They pecked faster. Something was spurring them on to greater efforts. Dopamine, the molecule of surprise, had been harnessed, and the scientific foundation of the slot machine was born. When Samantha saw her old boyfriend, all the feelings came rushing back: excitement, possibility, focus, butterflies. She wasn't on the prowl for romance, but she didn't have to be. DeMarco's appearance, and the half-conscious dream of another chance at passionate excitement, was an unexpected treat dropped into her emotional life. And that surprise was the source of her excitement. Samantha, of course, didn't know that. She and DeMarco decide to meet again for a drink, and it goes well. They decide to have lunch the next day, too, and pretty soon their meetings become a standing date. The feelings are exhilarating. They touch when they talk. They hug when they part. When they are together, the time flies, just like when they dated before. And, when she thinks about it, just like it used to be with Sean. Maybe, she thinks, DeMarco's the one. But with an understanding of the role of dopamine, it's clear that this relationship is not something new. It's just another repetition of dopamine-driven excitement. The novelty that triggers dopamine doesn't go on forever. When it comes to love, the loss of passionate romance will always happen eventually. And then comes a choice. We can transition to a love that's fed by a day-to-day appreciation of that other person in the here and now, or we can end the relationship and go in search of another roller coaster ride. Choosing the dopaminergic kick takes little effort, but it ends fast, like the pleasure of eating a Twinkie. Love that lasts shifts the emphasis from anticipation to experience, from the fantasy of anything being possible to engagement with reality and all its imperfections. The transition is difficult, and when the world presents an easy way out of a difficult task, we tend to take it. That's why, when the dopamine firing of early romance ends, many relationships end, too. Early love is a ride on a merry-go-round that sits at the foot of a bridge. That carousel can take you around and around on a beautiful trip as many times as you like, but it will always leave you where you began. Each time the music stops and your feet are back on the ground, you must make a choice. Take one more whirl, or cross that bridge to another, more enduring kind of love. Mick Jagger, George Costanza, and Satisfaction. When Mick Jagger first sang I Can't Get No Satisfaction, in 1965, we could not have known that he was predicting the future. As Jagger told his biographer in 2013, he has been with about 4,000 women, a different partner every 10 days of his adult life. Note that Mick didn't follow up with, and at 4,000, I finally found satisfaction. I'm done. Presumably he'll keep going as long as he can. So how many lovers would be enough to get satisfaction? If you've had 4,000, we can safely say that dopamine is steering things in your life, at least when it comes to sex. And dopamine's prime directive is more. If Sir Mick chases satisfaction another half-century, he still won't catch it. His idea of satisfaction is not satisfaction at all. It's pursuit, which is driven by dopamine, the molecule that cultivates perpetual dissatisfaction. After he beds a lover, his immediate goal will be to find another. In this way, Mick isn't alone. He isn't even unusual. Mick Jagger is just a confident version of TV's George Costanza. In nearly every episode of Seinfeld, George fell in love. He went to ridiculous lengths to get a date, and he was capable of almost anything if it might lead to sex. He imagined each new woman as a potential life mate, the perfect female who would go with him into happily ever after. But every Seinfeld fan knows how those stories ended. George would be crazy about the woman up until the moment she returned his affection. When he didn't have to try anymore, all he wanted was out. George Louis Costanza was so addicted to the dopamine thrill of chasing romance that he spent an entire season trying to extract himself from his engagement to the only woman who continued to love him despite every awful thing he did. And when his fiancée died from licking toxic glue on the envelopes of their wedding invitations, George wasn't devastated. He was relieved, even joyful. He was ecstatic to rejoin the chase. Nick is like George, and George is like all of us. We revel in the passion, the focus, the excitement, the thrill of finding new love. The difference is that most of us figure out at some point that dopamine lies to us. Unlike the former latex salesman for Vandelay Industries and the lead singer of the Rolling Stones, we come to understand that the next beautiful woman or a handsome man we see is probably not the key to satisfaction. "How's Sean?" said Samantha's mother. "Well," Samantha traced the rim of her coffee cup. "This isn't the way I expected it to be." "Again, here it comes," said Samantha. "I'm just saying that Sean seems like a great guy, Mother. I don't want to play count your blessings. This isn't the first time. Remember Lawrence and DeMarco?" Samantha bit her lip. "Why can't you enjoy the things you have?" The chemical keys to long-lasting love. From dopamine's point of view, having things is uninteresting. It's only getting things that matters. If you live under a bridge, dopamine makes you want a tent. If you live in a tent, dopamine makes you want a house. If you live in the most expensive mansion in the world, dopamine makes you want a castle on the moon. Dopamine has no standard for good and seeks no finish line. The dopamine circuits in the brain can be stimulated only by the possibility of whatever is shiny and new. Never mind how perfect things are at the moment. The dopamine motto is more. Dopamine is one of the instigators of love, the source of the spark that sets off all that follows. But for love to continue beyond that stage, the nature of the love relationship has to change because the chemical symphony behind it changes. Dopamine isn't the pleasure molecule, after all. It's the anticipation molecule. To enjoy the things we have, as opposed to the things that are only possible. Our brains must transition from future-oriented dopamine to present-oriented chemicals, a collection of neurotransmitters we call the here and now molecules, or the H and an S. Most people have heard of the H and an S. They include serotonin, oxytocin, endorphins, and a class of chemicals called endocannabinoids. As opposed to the pleasure of anticipation via dopamine, these chemicals give us pleasure from sensation and emotion. In fact, one of the endocannabinoid molecules is called anandamide, named after a Sanskrit word that means joy, bliss, and delight, according to anthropologist Helen Fisher. Early or passionate love lasts only 12 to 18 months. After that, for a couple to remain attached to one another, they need to develop a different sort of love called companionate love. Companionate love is mediated by the H and an S because it involves experiences that are happening right here. Right now, you're with the one you love. So enjoy it. Companionate love is not a uniquely human phenomenon. We see it among animal species that mate for life. Their behavior is characterized by cooperative territory defense and nest building. The bonded pair feed each other, groom each other, and share parental chores. Most of all, they stay close to each other and display expressions of anxiety when separated. It's the same for humans. Humans engage in similar activities and have similar feelings, particularly satisfaction that there is another person whose life is deeply entwined with their own. When the H and an S take over in the second stage of love, dopamine is suppressed. It has to be because dopamine paints a picture in our minds of a rosy future in order to spur us on through the hard work necessary to make it a reality. Dissatisfaction with the present state of affairs is an important ingredient in bringing about change, which is what a new relationship is all about. H and N companionate love, on the other hand, is characterized by deep and enduring satisfaction with the present reality, and an aversion to change, at least with regard to one's relationship with one's partner. In fact, though dopamine and H and N circuits can work together, under most circumstances they counter each other. When H and N circuits are activated, we are prompted to experience the real world around us, and dopamine is suppressed. When dopamine circuits are activated, we move into a future of possibilities, and H and S are suppressed. Laboratory testing supports this idea. When scientists looked at blood cells extracted from people who were in the passionate stage of love, they found lower levels of H and N serotonin receptors compared to healthy people, an indicator that the H and S were in retreat. It's not easy to say farewell to the dopaminergic thrill of new partners and passionate longing, but the ability to do so is a sign of maturity and a step toward long-lasting happiness. Think of a man who plans a vacation to Rome. He spends weeks scheduling each day, making sure he will be able to visit all the museums and landmarks he's heard so much about. But when he stands among the most beautiful artwork ever created, he thinks about how he's going to get to the restaurant where he has reservations for dinner. He's not ungrateful to see the masterpieces of Michelangelo. It's just that his personality is primarily dopaminergic. He enjoys anticipation and planning more than doing. Lovers experience the same disconnect between anticipation and experience. The early part, passionate love, is dopaminergic, exhilarating, idealized, curious, future-looking. The later part, companionate love, is H&N focused, satisfying, peaceful, and experienced through bodily senses and emotions. A romance built on dopamine is a thrilling, if short-lived, roller coaster ride. But our brain chemistry gives us the tools to move down the path that leads to companionate love. Just as dopamine is the molecule of obsessive yearning, the chemicals most associated with long-term relationships are oxytocin and vasopressin. Oxytocin is more active in women and vasopressin in men. Scientists have studied these neurotransmitters in the laboratory in a variety of animals. For example, when scientists injected oxytocin into the brains of female prairie voles, the animals formed a long-term bond with whatever male happened to be around. Similarly, when male voles that were genetically programmed to be promiscuous were given a gene that boosted vasopressin, they mated with one female exclusively, even though other receptive females were available. Vasopressin acted like a good husband hormone. Dopamine does the opposite. Human beings who have genes that produce high levels of dopamine have the highest number of sexual partners and the lowest age of first sexual intercourse. Most couples have sex less frequently as obsessive dopaminergic love evolves into companionate H&N love. This makes sense, since oxytocin and vasopressin suppress the release of testosterone. In a similar way, testosterone suppresses the release of oxytocin and vasopressin, which helps explain why men with naturally high quantities of testosterone in their blood are less likely to marry. Similarly, single men have more testosterone than married men. And if a man's marriage becomes unstable, his vasopressin falls, and his testosterone goes up. Do human beings require long-term companionship? There's good evidence that the answer is yes, despite the superficial appeal of having multiple partners. Most people eventually settle down. A United Nations survey found that more than 90% of men and women marry by the age of 49. We can live without companionate love, but the majority of us arrange a good portion of our lives around trying to find it and keep it. The H&Ns give us the ability to do that. They allow us to find satisfaction in what our senses deliver, what is right in front of us, and what we can experience without the nagging sense that we need something more. Testosterone, the here and now chemical of sexual attraction. The night Samantha first met Sean, she was on day 13 of her menstrual cycle. Why does that matter? Testosterone drives sexual desire in both men and women. Men produce large amounts. It's responsible for aspects of masculinity such as facial hair, increased muscle mass, and a low-pitched voice. Women produce smaller amounts in their ovaries. On average, women have the highest levels of testosterone on days 13 and 14 of their menstrual cycle. That's when the egg is released from the ovary, and they are most likely to get pregnant. There are also random variations from day to day and even within a day. Some women produce more testosterone in the morning, others later in the day. The largest variation is between individuals. Some women naturally produce more than others. Testosterone can even be administered as a drug. When scientists at Procter & Gamble applied a testosterone gel to women's skin, the women had more sex. Unfortunately, some of the women developed facial hair, low-pitched voices, and male pattern baldness, so the female Viagra gel never received Food and Drug Administration approval in the United States. Helen Fisher, an anthropologist at Rutgers University and chief scientific advisor to the internet dating site Match.com, points out that the type of sexual drive testosterone produces is similar to other natural urges, such as hunger. When one is hungry, all kinds of different foods will satisfy the urge to eat. Similarly, when a person experiences testosterone-induced sexual urges, the desire is for sex in general, not necessarily for a particular person. In many cases, especially with young people, nearly anyone will do. Neither is it an overwhelming desire. People don't die from sexual hunger. Testosterone doesn't drive them to commit suicide or murder. Unlike the dopaminergic experience of being overwhelmed by love, Sean wiped a clear space in the steamed-over bathroom mirror, ran his fingers through his black hair, smiled. "This'll work," he said. "Wait, hold still," said Samantha. She swept a lock off his forehead. "This'll make you look so handsome." And then, "Down, boy," said Samantha, and she gave him a peck on the cheek. Dopamine gets you into bed, and then gets in the way. From eager anticipation to the physical pleasures of intimacy, the stages of sex recapitulate the stages of love. Sex is love on fast forward. Sex begins with desire, a dopaminergic phenomenon driven by the hormone testosterone. It continues with arousal, another forward-looking, dopaminergic experience. As physical contact begins, the brain shifts control to the HNS to deliver the pleasure of the sensory experience. Mainly with the release of endorphins, the consummation of the act, orgasm, is almost entirely a here-and-now experience. With endorphins and other H&N neurotransmitters working together to shut down dopamine. This transition was caught on camera when men and women in the Netherlands were placed in brain scanners and then stimulated to orgasm. The scans showed that sexual climax was associated with decreased activation throughout the prefrontal cortex, a dopaminergic part of the brain responsible for placing deliberate restrictions on behavior. The relaxation of control allowed the activation of H&N circuits necessary for sexual climax. It didn't matter whether the person being tested was a man or a woman. With few exceptions, the brain's response to orgasm was the same: dopamine off, H&N on. That's how it's supposed to be. But just as some people have difficulty moving from passionate love to companionate love, it can also be difficult for dopamine-driven people to let the H&NS take over during sex. That is, highly driven women and men sometimes find it a significant challenge to turn off their thoughts and just experience the sensations of intimacy. To think less and feel more, while H&N neurotransmitters let us experience reality, and reality during sex is intense. Dopamine floats above reality. It is always able to conjure up something better. To add to its seduction, it puts us in control of that alternate reality. That these imagined worlds may be impossible doesn't matter. Dopamine can always send us chasing phantoms. Sexual encounters, especially those within ongoing relationships, fall prey to these dopamine phantoms all the time. A survey of 141 women found that 65% of them daydreamed during intercourse about being with another person or even doing something completely different. Other studies have put the figure as high as 92%. Men daydream during sex about as much as women, and the more sex both men and women have, the more likely they are to daydream. It is ironic that brain circuits that give us the energy and motivation we need to get ourselves into bed with a desirable partner subsequently get in the way of our enjoying the fun. Part of it may involve the intensity of the experience. Sex for the first time is more intense than sex for the 100th time, especially sex for the 100th time with the same partner. But the climax of the experience, orgasm, is almost always intense enough to move even the most attached dreamer into the immediate world of H&N. Why mom wants you to wait until you're married. Though changes in culture have made the attitude pass in some quarters, there are still a lot of mothers who encourage their daughters to save themselves for marriage. This is often a part of a larger moral or religious teaching. But is there any advantage to waiting that is based in brain chemistry? Testosterone and dopamine have a special relationship. During passionate love, testosterone is the one H&N that is not suppressed in favor of dopamine. In fact, they work together to form a feedback loop, a perpetual motion machine that enhances our feelings of romance. Passionate love usually increases the desire to have sex. Testosterone revs up that desire. Increased desire in turn increases passionate love. Therefore, denying sexual satisfaction actually enhances passion. Not necessarily forever, of course, and not without significant sacrifice. But the effect is real. Thus we find a chemical explanation that, long ago, may have been at least part of the basis for behavior we see today. Waiting prolongs the most exciting phase of love. The bittersweet feelings of distance and denial are the business end of a chemical reaction. Passion deferred is passion sustained. If mom wants her daughter to get married, amplifying the passion is a good way to help things along. Dopamine tends to shut down once fantasy becomes reality. And dopamine is the driving chemical of romantic love. So what would raise dopamine more, agreeing to sex now, or keeping it in the future? Mom knows the answer, even if we're only now learning why. Sean had gained a little weight, but Samantha found him more attractive than ever. Sean thought Samantha looked better than ever, too. Even though he appreciated how great she looked dressed up, he confided to his friends that nothing was sexier to him than when she woke up with tangled hair and no makeup, wearing one of his old t-shirts from college. Lately they kept their voices low to steal a few extra minutes while the baby slept, because the morning, alone and unguarded, was a rare moment when they could enjoy the presence of each other. Samantha had learned how to help Sean overcome the insecurities that held him back at work, and he found ways to free up time for her, so she could pursue her master's degree. But more and more they just savored each other's company. Sometimes they didn't talk at all, and while once that would have seemed strange to them, these days it just felt right. Samantha remembered the night Sean reached for her, stroked her hip, then took back his hand. She heard him flip over and make the sound he always made just before going to sleep. "What's wrong?" she asked. "Nothing," said Sean. "Just making sure you're there." Dopamine got the nickname the pleasure molecule based on experiments with addictive drugs. The drugs lit up dopamine circuits, and test participants experienced euphoria. It seemed simple until studies done with natural rewards, food, for example, found that only unexpected rewards triggered dopamine release. Dopamine responded not to reward, but to reward prediction error. The actual reward minus the expected reward. That's why falling in love doesn't last forever. When we fall in love, we look to a future made perfect by the presence of our beloved. It's a future built on a fevered imagination that falls to pieces when reality reasserts itself 12 to 18 months later. Then what? In many cases it's over. The relationship comes to an end, and the search for a dopaminergic thrill begins all over again. Alternatively, the passionate love can be transformed into something more enduring. It can become companionate love, which may not thrill the way dopamine does, but has the power to deliver happiness. Long-term happiness based on H&N neurotransmitters such as oxytocin, vasopressin, and endorphin. It's like our favorite old haunts, restaurants, shops, even cities. Our affection for them comes from taking pleasure in the familiar ambience, the real, physical nature of the place. We enjoy the familiar not for what it could become, but for what it is. That is the only stable basis for a long-term, satisfying relationship. Dopamine, the neurotransmitter whose purpose is to maximize future rewards, starts us down the road to love. It revs our desires, illuminates our imagination, and draws us into a relationship on an incandescent promise. But when it comes to love, dopamine is a place to begin, not to finish. It can never be satisfied. Dopamine can only say, more.